Judge Samuel Pierce was a man of routine. He prided himself on his punctuality, his ability to quickly read a case file, and his firm, no-nonsense approach to the law. His courtroom had earned a reputation for being efficient, and his decisions were rarely questioned. But today, something felt different. Sitting at his bench, the judge scanned the case in front of him with the practiced eye of someone who had been on the bench for over 20 years. The file was thick. One of those cases that appeared to be more about paperwork than about people. It was a routine violation of federal environmental regulations, filed by the Environmental Protection Agency against a woman named Maya Williams. She stood in front of him, a black woman in her early 30s, her posture straight and her eyes focused, but not in the way of someone guilty or fearful. Her calm presence intrigued the judge at first. She wasn't someone who looked out of place in his courtroom, but there was something about her that didn't quite fit the typical defendant. She wasn't dressed in the usual attire he associated with people facing minor violations, no wrinkled shirts or hastily done-up ties. Instead, she wore a sharp but simple suit, a crisp white blouse, and a determined expression. There was an aura of confidence about her that suggested she was more than just an ordinary person in this space. Maya Williams, Judge Pierce thought, had probably found herself tangled in some bureaucratic oversight, a woman who had unintentionally missed a filing deadline or made an honest mistake. It was the kind of case the judge had dealt with hundreds of times over the years, and it wasn't one that typically required much reflection. The paperwork was in order. She had violated a federal regulation regarding energy efficiency standards, and the fine was clearly listed. Without much hesitation, the judge looked at her with a neutral gaze and addressed the matter. "Ms. Williams," Judge Pierce began, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to issuing decisions without delay, "you have been found in violation of the Clean Energy Act. The evidence is clear, and there appears to be no dispute in your case. Therefore, I am imposing a fine of $5,000. Please ensure that payment is made within 30 days, and we can consider this matter closed." Maya didn't flinch. She nodded respectfully, her expression unwavering. "Yes, Your Honor, I understand." There was no pleading, no back and forth, no effort to justify herself. Her calm response almost unnerved the judge. He expected some form of resistance, maybe even a request for leniency, but she seemed unfazed by the fine. It was as though this moment was just another obstacle in a much larger journey, and it wasn't worth the emotional energy to argue over. Judge Pierce looked at his paperwork once again, confirming the details before moving on. "Very well. Case closed." And with that, the gavel came down. It was a simple transaction of the court, a minor violation, a fine, and the next case. The judge moved on quickly to the next docket, not giving a second thought to Maya Williams. In the grand scope of his career, this was nothing more than another day at work. But little did Judge Pierce know, this moment would come to define his career in ways he could never have imagined. The following days would bring with them an unexpected twist. Maya Williams, it turned out, was not just a random defendant caught up in a minor mistake. She was one of the most influential leaders in the country's green energy movement, a woman whose work shaped policies that impacted millions. Her efforts had led to groundbreaking changes in energy efficiency and renewable resources, particularly in underfunded communities that had long been ignored by mainstream energy policies. But none of this was known to Judge Pierce. He had never heard of her before that day in his courtroom, and for him, Maya Williams was nothing more than a name on a case file. In his mind, she was just another person who had slipped up in a system that demanded perfection, a system he was there to enforce without exceptions. However, Maya's story didn't stop with a courtroom fine. She was far more than a minor violation, and her work was about to make headlines in a way no one expected. Over the next few days, her name began to surface in the media, not for her legal troubles, but for her pivotal role in federal environmental initiatives. Maya was a leader in the country's push for green energy reform, a key architect of policies that helped lower-income households transition to sustainable energy sources. She had worked with lawmakers, utility companies, and community organizers to bring real, lasting change to an issue that had been neglected for far too long. As news outlets began to report on Maya's background and her significant contributions to green energy, Judge Pierce's office was flooded with calls, emails, and messages. People wanted to know if he was aware of who he had just fined. Colleagues in the legal field reached out with the same question. Did you know who she is? It became clear to the judge, almost immediately, that this case was far from ordinary, and Maya Williams was not just another defendant. For the first time in years, Judge Pierce found himself questioning his own decisions. Had he made a mistake? Judge Pierce couldn't escape the mounting buzz about Maya Williams. What had once seemed like a simple, almost forgettable case now loomed larger in his mind. He began to realize just how little he knew about the woman who stood before him in court. He had heard the name before, of course, but it was always in passing, never in a context that demanded his full attention. She was a name among many in the fields of policy and law, nothing special in his line of work, or so he thought. The first hint of Maya's importance came when the news outlets started reporting on her connection to the Green New Deal. Headlines flashed across his computer screen. Maya Williams at the forefront of federal green energy initiatives, and Black woman leading green energy reforms for low-income communities. The articles painted a picture of someone whose work was having a profound impact on the nation's shift toward renewable energy. Maya was no minor player in the environmental space. She was a senior advisor to the Department of Energy, spearheading efforts to ensure that clean energy wasn't just a privilege for the wealthy, but was accessible to the country's underserved communities. She had been instrumental in crafting policies that provided incentives for affordable housing to integrate solar panels, and she worked tirelessly to negotiate partnerships between the government and private sector to boost renewable energy infrastructure across the nation. Maya's name appeared in discussions about climate change and energy policy reform. She was praised for her tireless advocacy, her innovative ideas, and the way she approached every problem with a solution-oriented mindset. In a time when climate change was becoming a central issue, Maya's work was cutting through barriers that had previously made it difficult to bring real solutions to communities in need. Judge Pierce, now reading more about her, felt an unfamiliar twinge of embarrassment. In the articles he found, Maya was described as a thought leader, an advocate for justice, and a change-maker. Her focus on sustainable energy had brought her recognition from both environmental groups and policymakers alike. But what had caught the judge's attention most was her background, how she had worked her way up from humble beginnings. She had grown up in a neighborhood where environmental concerns were a distant thought, overshadowed by economic hardship. It was there that her passion for sustainability had ignited, fueling her drive to give back to communities like the one she had come from. He felt the weight of his earlier decision pressing on him. This wasn't just a bureaucratic violation. This was a person making a real, lasting difference in a world that so often ignored the underprivileged. How had he missed that? As the days passed, the flood of questions and conversations about Maya Williams intensified. What had started as a minor courtroom case had quickly become a major point of public interest. News outlets and social media platforms were filled with discussions about the fine imposed on her, with many people questioning the judge's decision to penalize someone whose contributions to the nation were so significant. In online forums, articles and op-eds started to circulate. Environmental advocates were the first to speak out, criticizing the fine as not only misguided but also a reflection of how society often overlooked the people doing the most critical work. How could a leader in the green energy movement, someone responsible for transforming the energy landscape for millions, be treated this way? One commentator wrote, "This fine is not just a slap in the face to Maya Williams. It's an insult to everyone fighting for climate justice." The questions grew louder as Maya's achievements came to the forefront. The Green New Deal she helped shape aimed to revitalize neighborhoods, create thousands of green jobs, and shift the energy infrastructure towards sustainable, renewable sources. She had worked alongside legislators, advocating for policies that would make solar energy accessible to low-income families, and spearheaded projects that would reduce pollution in marginalized communities. Maya's name had been synonymous with progress and change, but it was now being associated with a courtroom fine, a penalty that seemed almost trivial compared to the scope of her work. Maya's supporters were vocal, launching campaigns to raise awareness about her work and calling for the judge to reconsider the fine. Hashtags like #JusticeForMaya and #ClimateChampion quickly gained traction, turning a courtroom decision into a national conversation. The outcry was growing, and the judge could feel the pressure mounting. His office was inundated with calls from colleagues, environmental groups, and even local politicians who were all asking the same question: how could you not know who she was? Judge Pierce felt the heat from every direction. His decision, which he had thought to be unremarkable, had become the subject of intense scrutiny. It wasn't just that Maya was a public figure. It was that she was a symbol of something far larger than any individual case. In the media's portrayal, she was a face of progress, fighting for a future that was cleaner and more equitable. And here he was, a judge whose ruling seemed to stand in direct opposition to that vision. The judge tried to maintain his composure, focusing on his work and sticking to his routine, but the questions didn't stop. Legal experts began to weigh in, pointing out the irony of someone who had dedicated their life to policy reform being penalized for what seemed like a trivial mistake in an otherwise impeccable record. Was it possible that the judge had made a simple but costly error? The weight of the situation was becoming inescapable. The spotlight was now on him, and he began to realize that Maya Williams was more than just a defendant. She was a key figure in an ongoing national conversation about the future of energy, climate justice, and economic inequality. The judge's mind raced. He had made a mistake, and he knew it now. But how would he fix it? Judge Pierce sat in his chambers late one evening, the quiet hum of the courthouse outside barely breaking the stillness. His desk, usually organized and neat, now seemed cluttered with papers, case files, media articles, printouts about Maya Williams. The weight of what had happened, what he had done, felt heavier by the hour. He had thought of little else since that day in the courtroom. A simple decision, he had believed, one that was in line with his decades of experience, his adherence to the law, his commitment to fairness. But now, with every passing day, the guilt settled deeper in his chest. It wasn't just the articles he had read. It wasn't even the criticisms from colleagues or the pressure from the public. It was the growing realization that he had judged Maya Williams without truly understanding her, without considering her legacy. He had looked at the case on paper and seen a standard violation. But in doing so, he had failed to see the woman behind the paperwork, the significance of her role in shaping national energy policy, her fight for equitable access to sustainable resources. As the media reports continued to pour in, Judge Pierce found himself diving deeper into Maya's work. He read about her background, how she had worked her way from a childhood in a struggling neighborhood, how she had fought to ensure that environmental issues were not only for the elite but for everyone, especially marginalized communities. Her passion for renewable energy wasn't just about saving the planet. It was about saving the people who had been left behind in the rush toward modernization. From advocating for solar energy in underserved areas to pushing for environmental justice reforms, Maya had become a powerful force in the green energy movement. The judge felt conflicted. On one hand, he knew the law must be upheld, and administrative violations couldn't simply be ignored. On the other, the more he read, the more he understood that Maya Williams wasn't someone to be punished. She was someone to be recognized. Was his decision truly just, or had he made a grave mistake in failing to acknowledge the bigger picture? He walked to the window and looked out at the city, the lights below twinkling in the dark. The more he thought about it, the more clear it became. Maya Williams deserved more than a fine. She deserved respect, acknowledgement, and perhaps even an apology. The realization hit him hard. He had been too quick to judge. He had seen the law, but not the person who was embodying a much greater cause. Suddenly, Judge Pierce knew what he had to do. It wasn't enough to simply review the case and move on. He had to take action, not just to correct the mistake, but to do so in a way that reflected the value of Maya's contributions. There was more at stake here than just a courtroom decision. There was the future of green energy, of justice, and of the communities that had relied on Maya's advocacy. His next move would be critical. Judge Pierce couldn't ignore the growing sense of unease that had settled within him. The more he thought about Maya Williams and her work, the more he felt a deep sense of responsibility, not just to her, but to the people she represented and to the larger cause she was championing. He had made a mistake, and now, in the face of overwhelming public pressure, he knew he had to make it right. But how? It was then that an idea struck him. Rather than continuing to watch from the sidelines or hiding behind his legal authority, he should reach out to Maya directly. He needed to understand her story, her motivations, and her vision for the future. He wasn't going to fix this by sitting in his office. He had to take the first step and meet with her. At first, Maya had been taken aback when the call came in. The judge, the man who had fined her, was asking for a meeting. She had expected her name to become part of a public spectacle, maybe even a legal challenge, but not a personal conversation with the very man who had been part of the controversy. Nevertheless, she agreed. She had nothing to hide. If anything, she was willing to explain her work and its broader impact, especially now that the spotlight had fallen on her. The meeting took place at a small cafe in the heart of the city, away from the formalities of the courthouse. Maya arrived first, sitting at a corner table by the window. She was dressed simply, but with the kind of elegance that spoke of someone who didn't need to try hard to stand out. Her presence was enough. She glanced at the clock, waiting for the judge. When Judge Pierce walked in, he was a little out of his element. He was used to commanding a courtroom, not sitting across from someone who was so clearly making a difference in the world. But there was no denying the weight of their encounter. He sat down slowly, unsure of how to begin, but Maya's calm demeanor put him at ease. "Thank you for meeting with me," Judge Pierce said, his voice uncharacteristically soft. "I'll admit, I've been reflecting on the decision I made in court." Maya smiled politely, not showing any sign of animosity. "I understand. It's not the first time a mistake has been made in the court system, and it won't be the last. But I'm glad you reached out." The conversation started with small talk, but soon the judge found himself listening intently as Maya shared her journey, from her childhood in an underfunded neighborhood, where she first noticed the lack of access to clean energy, to her work in Washington, D.C., pushing for policies that would change the future of energy in America. She spoke with such passion and clarity that Judge Pierce couldn't help but be captivated by her vision for a more sustainable, inclusive future. She explained the many projects she had worked on, the partnerships with local governments, and how her goal was always to ensure that green energy wasn't just a luxury for the wealthy, but a necessary resource for everyone, especially those who had been left behind. Maya's work wasn't about accolades or recognition. It was about creating real-world solutions that had the power to change lives. The judge listened, his initial discomfort fading with each word. What had seemed like a simple fine now felt so small in the context of the work Maya was doing. By the end of their meeting, Judge Pierce realized that Maya Williams wasn't just a defendant in a case. She was a trailblazer, and it was time for him to own up to the misjudgment he had made. After their conversation, Judge Pierce found himself grappling with the weight of Maya's words. Her story had touched something deep within him, a reminder of why he had initially become a judge. To serve justice, yes, but also to ensure that those who were working for the greater good were recognized, not penalized. Maya Williams wasn't just a participant in society's larger narrative. She was helping to rewrite it, and he had almost missed that. The next few days were a blur for the judge. He couldn't stop thinking about the impact of his decision, about the simple fine he had imposed on someone whose life's work was entirely about lifting people up, especially those whose struggles often went unseen. The more he reflected, the more he realized that he couldn't allow the matter to rest as it had. He owed Maya, and the community she represented, a public acknowledgement, not just for her work, but for the mistake he had made in failing to understand it. In a bold and unexpected move, Judge Pierce reached out to the court's communications department, asking for assistance in crafting an official statement. The idea of publicly reversing a decision was rare, and in many legal circles, it was seen as an admission of failure. But the judge was resolved. Maya's work deserved recognition, and the people who relied on it deserved to know that justice wasn't just about following the rules. It was also about making things right when the system faltered. The statement was carefully written. It wasn't a retraction of the fine. It couldn't be, legally, but it was an acknowledgement of his error in judgment. In it, the judge expressed deep respect for Maya Williams and her dedication to environmental and social causes, especially in underserved communities. He emphasized that while the court's role was to uphold the law, it was equally important to ensure that the law served the greater good. The judge publicly apologized for the oversight, clarifying that the fine imposed was done without a full understanding of Maya's work and its profound impact. The announcement was met with mixed reactions. Legal professionals and some of his peers saw it as an unprecedented move for a judge, one that would set a precedent in the realm of public accountability. Some were critical, arguing that it was too much of a concession. But for others, environmental activists, Maya's supporters, and the public, it was a breath of fresh air. It wasn't just a fine being overturned. It was a message that the legal system was capable of introspection, of learning from its mistakes and correcting them. Maya herself, though appreciative of the gesture, remained humble. She knew that the work wasn't done. The apology was important, but the real victory lay in the continued fight for clean energy and social justice. Still, she was grateful for the judge's decision to speak out publicly, a moment that would resonate with many who had seen their own struggles dismissed or ignored. As news outlets picked up on the judge's apology, the spotlight shifted back to Maya's accomplishments. This time, however, it was paired with the recognition she deserved, not as someone fined by the system, but as a trailblazer in the fight for justice. The public apology from Judge Pierce set off a ripple effect that reverberated far beyond the courthouse. Media outlets, especially those that had followed Maya's story from the beginning, hailed the judge's decision as a rare moment of introspection and accountability. It wasn't often that someone in a position of power publicly acknowledged a mistake, especially when the decision had been scrutinized so intensely. The apology became a talking point for weeks, with pundits and commentators discussing its implications for both the legal system and the broader societal framework. For Maya, the apology was unexpected, but it wasn't what defined her journey. She had always known that real change came from sustained effort and hard work, not from fleeting moments of recognition. Still, she appreciated the gesture. What mattered most to her now was what came next, the continuation of her mission to bring clean, accessible energy to the communities that had long been neglected. In the weeks following the apology, Maya's work gained even more traction. Local governments began to reach out to her team for advice on how to implement renewable energy programs in their areas. Corporations that had been hesitant about investing in green energy now saw an opportunity to align themselves with Maya's vision, pushing forward with investments in solar and wind energy projects. Her initiative was no longer just a government program. It was a movement. Maya's leadership also sparked important conversations about the intersection of race, economic disparity, and environmental justice. She was often invited to speak at conferences and forums, where she shared her insights on how marginalized communities could be empowered through sustainable solutions. Her focus wasn't just on technology. It was on people. She knew that any real green transition had to address the needs of those who had been excluded from economic and environmental benefits for too long. Judge Pierce, on the other hand, found himself more introspective than ever. He began to look more closely at the cases that came before him, questioning not just the legalities but the human stories behind them. He met with other judges to discuss the idea of restorative justice and how their rulings could better reflect the broader social impact of their decisions. The experience with Maya had changed him, made him realize that justice wasn't just about enforcing laws. It was about understanding their implications for people's lives. Maya's work in green energy and her role as a thought leader were now well established. But the judge's actions had given her a platform that she hadn't anticipated. The apology had not only shed light on her contributions, but had also made clear that the legal system could be open to dialogue and correction when needed. As the media buzzed with discussions of accountability and justice, Maya kept her focus on the future. She knew that the path ahead wouldn't always be easy, but with every step forward, she was determined to bring sustainable solutions to the communities that had been overlooked for too long. And now, she had more people in her corner than ever before. Months after the judge's public apology, the story of Maya Williams and Judge Pierce had transformed into something much larger than the initial courtroom case. It had become a symbol of how systems, both legal and societal, could learn, grow, and ultimately become more just. The apology had been just the beginning of a journey that both Maya and Judge Pierce would continue down in their own ways. Maya's influence had spread like wildfire, with her green energy initiatives reaching new heights. She was now working with state governments and large urban centers to implement programs that would not only reduce carbon emissions, but also create job opportunities in communities that had long been left out of the economic conversation. Her work had reached a scale that was changing the trajectory of the country's approach to sustainable energy. From town hall meetings to global climate summits, Maya had become an internationally recognized leader. Her focus on marginalized communities, in particular, resonated deeply with people who had often felt ignored in political and environmental discussions. She was invited to the United Nations to speak about the need for equity in climate policy, and soon after, she was appointed to lead a global coalition on climate action, advocating for policies that prioritize the needs of developing countries. Her work had become a blueprint for others to follow, and Maya was no longer just a policymaker. She was a global icon. For Judge Pierce, life had taken a more introspective turn. The case with Maya had opened his eyes to the way he viewed his role in the justice system. He had always prided himself on being impartial and following the law. But now he understood that impartiality didn't mean ignoring the deeper context behind each case. The legal system wasn't just about punishment. It was about understanding the complexities of people's lives. Inspired by his conversations with Maya, Judge Pierce had begun to advocate for restorative justice practices within his community. He organized forums with local leaders to discuss how the courts could better serve not just as enforcers of the law, but as facilitators of healing. His newfound perspective influenced other judges and legal professionals, prompting a wave of change within the judicial system. One afternoon, months after their initial meeting, Maya invited Judge Pierce to a ribbon-cutting ceremony for a new solar panel initiative in one of the country's most impoverished neighborhoods. The project was the result of a public-private partnership Maya had worked tirelessly to establish, and it was a moment of great pride for her. When Judge Pierce stood beside her at the ceremony, he knew that their journey wasn't about a single case, but about a broader commitment to fairness, accountability, and social change. The two exchanged a knowing look as the crowd cheered, a silent acknowledgement that their unlikely encounter had sparked something much bigger, a lasting collaboration to ensure that justice, in all its forms, was accessible to everyone. In the end, their story was more than just about a fine or a mistake. It was about the power of understanding, the willingness to learn from each other, and the drive to make the world a better place for those who needed it most.